The miraculous rise of liberty. There it is. Let's get started, shall we? We should begin with prayer this afternoon, shouldn't we? Let's pray. Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the Sabbath day you've given to us. A day to reflect on you as our Creator, our Sustainer, our Redeemer, and our soon-coming King. I pray that as we look at these historical facts through the lenses of prophecy and the principles of your kingdom, and through the lenses of providential history, we ask for your wisdom and guidance as we study through this. In Jesus' name, amen. The miraculous rise of liberty. This session is largely comprised of miracle stories. I was collecting miracle stories in American history a while back, so we'll do a lot of that. But I want to start with a quotation from Testimonies, a very short quotation, from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 264. And this was stated in the context of the Civil War that was going on during the time of the early Advent movement there in Volume 1 of the Testimonies. And the statement was that God has the destiny of this nation in his hands. Isn't that an interesting statement right out of the gates? When you study American history particularly, and not at the exclusion of God is guiding everybody, every human, everywhere, but nations that have a prophetic implication, who are prophesied about in Revelation 13 as becoming a second beast that speaks like a dragon, or in Revelation 12 as being the place where the earth helped out the woman, that's going to be a place that God exercises special interest in the destiny of that nation being so prophetically significant. So the scripture for the afternoon is the same one from this morning, and the earth helped out the woman. This doesn't apply just to 1620. We kind of pinpointed that as really the beginnings and the origins of America. Maybe during Q&A somebody would say, why did you do 1620 and not 1607 with Jamestown? But that's another discussion. I kind of like to base the origins and the foundation of the American Republic in that 1620 arrival, not 1630 with Massachusetts Bay, but 1620 with Plymouth Colony. We'll see the difference between those two as we go forward. But the earth helped out the woman applies to all of this history of finding freedom to worship. And that particularly happened in America, a relatively unpopulated area compared to that of Europe. Now, I wanted to start actually, with an amazing fact. You could say this was a answered prayer story that people might not think of as a typical miracle story on the battlefield or something like that. But it's just a fun one that I want to start with this afternoon. George Washington Carver is an American historical figure that every kid in school has learned or should learn about. You know about his popularization of many uses for the peanut as a scientist. Did you know he came up with those ideas in answer to prayer? Here's how he stated it in 1920. Interesting date, 300 years from. Anyway, he says, "Years ago, I went into my laboratory and said, 'Dear Mr. Creator, please tell me what the universe was made for.' The great Creator answered, 'You want to know too much for that little mind of yours. Ask for something more your size, little man.' Then I asked, 'Please, Mr. Creator, tell me what man was made for.' Again, the Creator replied, 'You are still asking too much.' So then I asked, 'Please, Mr. Creator, will you tell me why the peanut was made?' That's better. But even that's infinite. What do you want to know about the peanut? Mr. Creator, can I make milk out of the peanut?" And then the great Creator taught me to take the peanut apart and put it together again, and out of the process have come forth all of these products, peanut-based products, including, he was talking about nut milk all the way back in 1920, huh? If you go to the first, this is another speech he did. He echoed this same theme before the House of Representatives. If you go to the first chapter of Genesis, we can interpret very clearly, I think, what God intended when he said, "Behold, I have given you every herb that bears seed. To you it shall be meat." This is what he means about it. It shall be meat. Don't you appreciate that fundamental approach to the Bible? Like the Bible actually means when it says evening and morning the first day, it was an evening and it was a morning and a day. That's an idea, right? Plant foods shall be your food. It shall be your meat. There is everything there in the plant kingdom to strengthen and nourish and keep the body alive and healthy. That's a pretty radical thing for him to say at that time, right? 100 years ago. The chairman asked, "Dr. Carver, where did you learn all these things?" He answered, "From an old book." The chairman asks, "What book?" Dr. Carver insists, "The Bible." The chairman says, "Does the Bible tell about peanuts?" "No, sir, but it tells about the God who made the peanut. I asked him to show me what to do with the peanut, and he did." So it's an answer to prayer story. The George Washington Carver genius that you learned about in grade school, he attributed to God answering his prayer to give him wisdom on what to do with the peanut. Now we're going to go way back to the 1700s. We're going to work our way through the founding generation with a couple of detours here and there. But you're probably aware that prior to 1776, there was no United States of America as an independent entity. There were 13 colonies, British colonies, and the main rival of the British at that time, do you know, was the Empire of France. So you got the British Empire and the French Empire competing for and carving up North America for their colonial possessions. So our first miracle story comes from before 1776. This is before there was an America as we know it. It's the 1740s. We're in the midst of King George's War between Britain and France. Now, as a part of that war, New France, as it was called at the time, which is modern-day Nova Scotia, New France's main port town, called Louisbourg, falls to the British in 1745. This is the third busiest seaport in North America, next to Boston, of course. The third busiest seaport in North America, in New France, has now been surrendered by the French to the British. So what do you think the French are going to do? Well, we're going to reconquer it. We're going to regroup, and we're going to come with a massive naval force to reconquer Louisbourg the next year. And while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and take Boston. This in Protestant New England. You see prophetic implications when you realize Catholic France here. This is before the French Revolution. Catholic France now attempting to conquer Boston. Not just Louisbourg, but the key here is to come for Protestant British colonies. So the French send 73 ships, 800 cannons, 13,000 troops, and on October 16, 1746, the pastor of the church in Boston, Reverend Thomas Prince, prays the following: "Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the waters. Scatter the ships of our tormentors." That was his prayer. You think prophecy has an interest in, does the God of prophecy have an interest in preserving Boston as a Protestant future state of America and not falling to Catholic France? The earth helped out the woman. Well, you understand that God intervenes in history in marvelous ways to facilitate the fulfillment of prophecy. Now, we want to be careful when we talk about that historically, though, because you could make this out to be British Empire good guys, French Empire bad guys, right? And then all of a sudden, the very British that were persecuting the separatists this morning, we all of a sudden have baptized them as being the army of God, like Constantine thought he was doing. So we're not going there, but God does intervene in ways that, according to his providence and prophecy, dictate. So America was to be a haven for the Protestant faith. So what do you think happens after this prayer? The French are on their way with this massive fleet, these hundreds of cannons and thousands of troops, as we just said. Right after this prayer, the sky darkens, the winds shriek, and this hurricane force wind scatters the French fleet as far as the Caribbean. Lightning strikes, exploding powder kegs and ships, and the French fleet is destroyed. They did not even make landfall. They did not even achieve their objective of recapturing Lewisburg, let alone Boston. So I want to fast forward, though, a couple generations on that topic of windstorms and weather patterns. I told you we'd take some detours, right? So we're still in the 1740s, but while we're on the topic of using weather in this way, 1812, are you familiar with the War of 1812? This is where the British are trying to recapture the American states for their colonial possessions. These rebels beat us in the Revolutionary War. We're going to go get them. And at that time, there was impressment of British soldiers and British sailors. Actually, Joseph Bates was one of those, if you've ever read his biography. So the British Empire was taking Americans captive, enslaving them, basically, to fight in their imperial wars with France and Napoleon. At this time, America stands up and says, we can't have that. The British says, we're coming after you. So they come and they do land, and they are wreaking havoc on Washington, D.C. Literally, they burned the White House. You know, the White House had it was burned in 1812. And beyond that, they were going to other buildings in D.C. They were just destroying everything. And they're a much more powerful military force than these ragtag American states, you know, still in its infancy in the early republic. So they're going to need some help, aren't they? Not by might nor by power. So what does the Lord do? All of a sudden, a great storm and a fierce tornado come upon the British, killing many of the British soldiers. I mean, how often do you see tornadoes that are killing people through Washington, D.C.? It occasionally happens, but right at the moment that this attack is going on, you're thinking, the Lord shall fight for you and you shall hold your peace, right? Again, not to make the American government akin to that of ancient Israel. We've got to be very careful with that, because there's some very erroneous theology out there about how human governments and nations become the government of God, and you enforce God's edicts, and then all of a sudden religious liberty is gone. So we'll get into that theme in a little bit. But God did definitely intervene. The British fled the city. The torrential rains for hours make everything muddy and extinguish the fires that had been lit by the British. The British now have to make it out in their retreat through downed trees, through muddy roads. Their ships have damaged rigging. Some of them had been run aground by the storm. And the British Navy said, well, okay, we'll not assault Washington, D.C. We're really focusing our target on Baltimore right now. They're bombarding the American fort with their cannonballs. 1,800 of them. That's no contest. I mean, the Americans have nothing against that, except the storm that had ravaged the British in D.C. moved to Baltimore and turned everything into mud. And the cannonballs are landing, half of them not exploding because of the soft landing. And that's where we get the national anthem from. Did you know that? It was that battle right there that the British did not succeed at destroying Baltimore, let alone D.C. And so Francis Scott Key wrote the famous words, and the flag was still there, as they held off the British miraculously. Now, back to the period of the mid-1700s. We're going to get up to the War for Independence shortly. But the 7 Years' War in 1755 is yet another British versus French war that's happening globally, really. This is a world war between the two. Wherever they wanted colonial possessions, this war was going on, particularly North America. So this is a 22-year-old British colonel at this time. You may recognize his name. He's a very important figure, George Washington, 22-year-old British colonel, engaged in a battle with the French as a British officer. Now, he was, in this key battle, the only British officer that survived this battle. The British were destroyed. They were flattened by the French. Now, here's what Washington later said about his survival providentially. He says, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me. What are the chances you get 4 bullets through the fabric of your coat and none of them hit you? That's just not probable, is it? He called it beyond human expectation. In other words, divine intervention. So again, Providence is holding off the French conquest of what would become the United States of America, and preserving the life of a very important founding father who, by the way, if you read the book Gospel Workers, you hear him mentioned in that as somebody who had a character that was admirable in the sense of he was self-disciplined, he did things by system and order, and a hardworking man, basically, is kind of what I take from that quote. I think that's kind of cool to see somebody who's even in the secular world having self-discipline and character that's mentioned in a Spirit of Prophecy book as admirable for us to emulate. By the way, while we're on the topic of bullets being diverted from the body in a miraculous way, a similar story happened to a president of the United States later in American history. Do you know what president that is? Do you know who that is? This is 1830s President Andrew Jackson. An assailant, a would-be assassin, comes at him with not one but two pistols, both loaded and ready to fire. He attempts to fire one, misfires, attempts to fire the other, both misfire. What are the chances of this, right? And Andrew Jackson said, "A kind of providence has been pleased to shield me against the recent attempt upon my life, and irresistibly carried many mind to the belief in a superintending providence." You know, they believed in a superintending providence, and they're not even necessarily particularly religious in their orientation. Believers in God, but they certainly would give credit where credit was due when the time came. History has definitely provided abundant evidence to back up the assertion that it was not him or any human mechanism that caused those pistols to misfire, because when the Bible prophesies something, God's superintending providences will facilitate that it gets fulfilled. Who's that? Do you know who that is? This is a real war hero, talking about the non-combatancy thing. I really like people like Desmond Doss, people that were medics and would run out into the field of battle. This is Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross. She's a war hero in her own right. She was delivering relief supplies, again, during the Civil War. I'm off the timeline again right now, but while we're on the topic of bullets, check this out. This incredible lady is carrying a wounded soldier from the field of battle, and while doing that, she wrote, "A ball had passed between my body," that's a bullet, "between my body and the right arm, which supported him." So she's carrying somebody here, and the bullet comes at her, but doesn't hit her. It just goes through the soldier that she was saving, cutting through his sleeve and passing through his chest from shoulder to shoulder. "There was no more to be done for him, and I left him to his rest." She understood the state of the dead, didn't she? Or at least she knows how to phrase it. "I have never mended," oh, that's amazing. She says, "I have never mended that hole in my sleeve," because she went on to say, soldiers who give their lives on the battlefield don't get the privilege of mending their garments when they are shot through. So in honor of these sacrificial soldiers, she said, "I'm never going to mend that hole in my sleeve." So again, bullets going through holes, or going through garments, but not hitting the person, whether it's Washington, Andrew Jackson, Clara Barton. Here's another bullets through coats, while we're on the topic of bullets through coats, but not hitting people. Back in 1820, remember when I told you about 1620, thank you for that. I appreciate that you guys are willing to do that. Sometimes people are just quiet and everybody's thinking it, but nobody says it. Nobody gives me a chance to correct it. But Miles Standish, the defense, the soldier that the Pilgrims had hired, he's taken them out on this expedition. Well, at one point, there was an assault of Indian fire. They were firing their bows, their arrows at them from the forest. And what happened here, according to William Bradford's account, he says the arrows were coming at them from all directions, but by the special providence of God, none of them either hit or hurt us, though many came close by us, and some coats which hung upon our barricade were shot through and through. So they had coats hanging up here. Those are getting shot through, the coats. So God likes to get our attention with garments getting wounded, but people being preserved. I love these missionaries, or these miracle stories. But you know, even better ones are the missionary miracle stories. You like mission stories? I mean, so many times the people who are on the front lines of winning souls and doing the mission work of God. We're kind of looking more at secular history here, but it's providential history as well. Not in the same sense as missionaries, but you got the idea. Back to George Washington. That was quite a detour on all over the time frame, but when we talk about bullets through garments, we got to hit a few, and when we talk about weather events. But now let's walk more systematically through the history here. George Washington and the War for Independence. Here we are, 1775 and on. You get a cluster of miracle stories during this period of the essential founding of America. So here you have the first naval engagement of the War for Independence. So it's the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. Here you have the British Navy. Now, when you hear the words the British Navy, you're thinking the most powerful navy in the world at this time. They defeated the Spanish Armada. Everything was history there. The British are number one. Now you've got a ragtag group of Continental Army soldiers on the land. No contest, right, for the strongest military power on the globe, the British Empire. Historians like to say, well, what happened here at Bunker Hill was quite a coincidence for the colonists, quite a fortunate coincidence that in this important opening battle, the British ships happened to be stocked with the wrong size cannonballs for their cannon. And they could not bombard the American position or the city of Boston with their cannon fire as they had hoped to. So 2,300 British soldiers have to disembark. Remember, they're the powerful naval force. They're now not as much at an advantage when they're having to land. And they suffered twice as many casualties as the Americans in that land battle that took place. That was supposed to be a naval annihilation. Another time in the war, the British held siege against the colonists at Boston. Siege meaning starving them out. Nothing's going in, nothing's going out, and we're going to starve you into submission. British General Howe said, okay, we're going to plan now 3,000 troops to go finish them off. They're going to charge Dorchester Heights, was the hill there. Before he could do it, though, just like happened in the War of 1812 a generation later, a violent storm caused turbulent seas and prevented the landing of these 3,000 troops. General Washington put it this way, that this most remarkable interposition of Providence is for some wise purpose, I have not a doubt. He didn't know Revelation 12 like we do, but you know it was for some wise purpose that God had the earth help the woman to create a land of religious freedom from where would flow the truth and the remnant church of Bible prophecy. So that's pretty neat. New York was the next target for the British. The British planned they said, okay, we're not holding back anymore. The largest land invasion force in history, we're just going to, 32,000 troops on 400 ships, we're going to go through and just take over these people. Enough of this. Well, you can imagine New York Harbor filled with hundreds of masts like tree trunks of these. I mean, that's pretty intimidating with the British Navy coming upon you like that. Even George Washington said, we are not, in men or in arms, prepared for it. That was his statement, facing the fact we don't have what it takes here. But you know what the rest of his quotation says? Providence will still go on to afford us aid. So he trusted and understood there was a divine guiding hand. The date is July 9, 1776. Does that sound close to another date you know in history? July 9, 1776 is 5 days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. And the Declaration of Independence is brought to the Continental Army at New York. And a copy is read. It's brought from Philadelphia where it had been signed. And the inspiration that they received from that document included these words, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They understood providence was guiding this war, this independence struggle. Now, again, that doesn't mean the Continental Army is the army of God. God's covenant in the New Testament is a covenant with the church. It's not a covenant with a nation in the same sense. So America is not modern Israel. I just want to repeat that because I don't want to go Constantinian on you here. And sometimes we might draw that idea out of this history, if otherwise not stated as a disclaimer a few times. However, when God says that it's going to happen in prophecy, it's going to happen. And he's going to involve himself in nations and even military battles to guide things according to his providence. It says in the Declaration of Independence, by the way, do you know that the Great Controversy, the book The Great Controversy, refers to the Declaration of Independence as that grand old document? You ever read that phrase in there? Oh, one of the best chapters in the whole book is the one on the Pilgrim Fathers, and then it includes this about the American founding, 1776. And that is the most famous and inspiring articulation of the equality, unalienable rights of the human person, and that all men are created equal. The best thing ever written, most cited on the topic outside of the Bible. And so that fact alone makes it relevant and makes it believable that it was Providence that was guiding in the aims of this struggle against the British Empire. 10,000 British troops then are landed elsewhere. They come from behind to trap the Continental Army between that force of 10,000 and the sea where their naval force is. So now the colonists, all they can do is retreat. I mean, they're trapped here. They know they're coming. They know they're here. There's nowhere to go. We got to get across the East River. This is New York. And interestingly, providentially, the waters of the East River at this point, when they need to stage their retreat, are notably calm. And this is known as the miraculous retreat across the East River by night, because you can't be detected. So interestingly, though, where the British ships are, the waters are especially boisterous once again. So half of Washington's forces are able to get through at night. And you might say, well, that does not sound like a miraculous retreat. Half of them are going to get slaughtered or taken prisoners of war and starve. Well, here's the miracle. Only half of them made it out under the cover of darkness at night. The other half remain and are nervous as the sun is rising, but they notice a mysterious, thick fog that has rested upon the morning atmosphere. A fog that detects them, or that conceals them just as well as the dark of night did. So they continue their retreat. Every single Continental Army soldier retreats safely without detection by the British. Ben Talmadge, the chief of intelligence of George Washington's army, said, "A very dense fog seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance." That means I wouldn't be able to see most of you guys, right? That's pretty cool. Oh, by the way, another dense fog story, 1812, the War of 1812. Before he was President Jackson, he was Colonel Jackson in the American Army against the British there. And it was a dense fog that this time mysteriously lifted to allow for the American assault on the British to win the victory in that very famous pivotal battle, the Battle of New Orleans, that turned the tide of the War of 1812. Jackson said, "It appears that the unerring hand of Providence shielded my men from the shower of balls, bombs, and rockets, while every ball and bomb from our guns carried with them a mission of death." You know, these guys aren't usually like the most humble people around. They could take the opportunity to say, greatest military commander ever, right? Like, check out what we did, and just go boast about their exploits. But they keep giving credit to God because it's so miraculous and so evident that it wasn't mere human genius that did these things. Well, the British gave up on the War of 1812. Not only because of that battle, but because Napoleon was gaining the advantage in Europe, and they needed to abandon their, if you will, their western front and go on to the mainland Europe. But back to the War for Independence. The turning point of the war has been, as it's been called, is the Battle of Saratoga, where the Americans gained the if you will, the turning point against the British in the war. Now, the British lost 6,000 of their soldiers and surrendered in that battle. And you might say, how and why is the superior military continuing to lose and be evaded and being, in this case, actually defeated? Elihu Yale stated it this way, a contemporary. He said, "To whom but the ruler of the winds shall we ascribe it that," here's how they lost the Battle of Saratoga, "that the British reinforcement in the summer of 1777 was delayed on the ocean 3 months by contrary winds until it was too late." So George Washington called that a signal stroke of providence. That turning point in the war was a turning point because at this point the French get involved on the American side, and now there's a naval force and an army to give aid to the American Continental Army. Without the French, Americans probably never would have beaten the British in the Revolutionary War. Now, you just have to pause sometimes, by the way, as you think back to the issue, the event called the Valley Forge Winter. This is 11,000 soldiers in December in the freezing conditions. Literally 2,500 Americans froze to death. They had black limbs. They had amputated limbs. And these were Americans from every state. And these states didn't all see eye to eye. They viewed themselves very, very differently, one state versus another, at least one region of the colonies versus another. But they were united in the appeal for independence and liberty as it was articulated in the Declaration of Independence. You've got children as young as 12 participating in this because they were so hard up for soldiers. You've got 60-year-old men, actually men as young as 12 years old. Can I say that? Because we know that in the Bible, the age 12 is where childhood ends and youth begins. But the moment a youth of age 12 is on the battlefield and participating at this level, side by side with men, I call that a young man, not a kid. But this included, there were African-American soldiers on the side of the Americans here, Native Americans. It was unity. And you just have to pause sometimes and be thankful to those who have sacrificed so much. Those brave Americans that sacrificed their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, right, for liberty that we enjoy. We owe them a debt of gratitude. 12,400 Americans at one point were put on British starving ships. And you might think, what? I've never heard of a starving ship. Well, that's what it is. They literally would just imprison thousands of Americans, 12,400 Americans, on these ships with no food or water until they starved to death. 11,000 Americans died just being starved to death. That's a 90% casualty rate. 12,400 of them, 11,000 die. That's more than twice as many American soldiers died in the whole war, in battle. So you had, about 5,000 Americans die in battle. 11,000 died on the starving ships. At Valley Forge, another 2,500 died of freezing to death. So it was really a brutal time for these people to go through. So just thinking really what that means for us, and how grateful you feel to have peace, prosperity, and liberty. The final act and defeat in the American Revolution was the Battle of Cowpens, and most notably, the pursuit of the Americans that followed. So the Americans gained the advantage in the battle, but then did their retreat. And it was the retreat that was particularly interesting because General Cornwallis of the British pursues the Continental Army right after the battle, and they're some distance behind, perhaps 2 hours distance is estimated. Now the Americans cross the Catawba River, at which point, on cue, as you would expect, a sudden storm causes the Catawba to rise substantially and delays the British pursuit further. You're starting to expect these things now, aren't you? You're like, yeah, I'm not surprised. That's how this history goes. So now they're further behind. But get this, there's another river the Americans cross, the Dan River. Same thing happens. After the Americans cross, the rain comes down, the floods come up, a flash flood blocks the British pursuit again. 2 in a row. That's pretty awesome. British Commander Henry Clinton admitted, this is a British commander, here the Royal Army was again stopped by a sudden rise of the waters, which had only just fallen, almost miraculously, to let the enemy over. I think you can remove the word almost from there, but he got the idea, didn't he? So in summing that all up, this period, George Washington said, this is the whole war. We have abundant reasons to thank Providence for its many favorable interpositions in our behalf. It has at times been my only dependence, for all other resources seemed to have failed us. Now, so far we've heard a lot about God having the destiny of this nation in his hands, right? To borrow from Testimonies Volume 1. We also know that America goes rogue in the last days in Revelation 13, that it speaks like a dragon. So when we go in that direction, does that mean all is lost? No, our hope was in a nation all along. No, our hope is in a better country and heavenly, right? And so while we can appreciate and love and be patriotic and really embrace the principles of America, know that our hope lies beyond that. And the only reason that the American history and principles have value to us is not because of some tribal identity or anything of that nature. It's simply because of those principles reflect the principles of heaven. Liberty, Protestantism, etc. It's important to make clear when people hear the lamb-like nation in Revelation 13, and we say the phrase, America is one, you know the phrase, one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all, from the Pledge of Allegiance. And on the money, it says, in God we trust. We're going to have to walk a tightrope on this, because there are two equally dangerous and insidious pits of civic philosophy that the world has been subjected to. And the beauty of the American Republic is that it walks this line. And so I want to walk through some of those ideas and sort of the ideologies of the world. And it begins by, bears repeating that when we look at a nation and its government and its military, that is not the equivalent of the Church of God. The kingdom of God is an entity that is transnational. It's just all humans who embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ, particularly the present truth in the last days. A nation, a government, as a total society will never equate to that. You can have proportions that rise, and that's our hope and desire, and we do that through evangelism. But simply put, we are never called as Christians to lord it over our fellow men, to rule over them. Jesus put it this way. He said to himself, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant." So you hear the pagans, the Gentiles, the heathen, those are the ones that seek power over others. This was the big mistake of Constantine that I mentioned a few times. If you don't know the story of Constantine, it's the 300s AD, and up till that point, Christianity had been comprised of people voluntarily associating in the Church of God, worshiping together, and they never sought imperial domination over others. But Constantine comes along, and for many reasons, he says, we're now going to wed the church and the state, and the military is going to be one Christian conquering force. He claims to have seen a vision of the sign of the cross, and it said, "In this sign you shall conquer." Now, is that what Jesus said? Is that what Christianity is about? Conquering other people and converting at the point of a sword? Not so. Not at all. So Constantine's theology actually gets picked up in modern times, and there's a school of thought called dominion theology. If you've never heard of this, it's something to be clued into. The dominion theology idea is we're going to take America back for God using legislative power, government force, and we're going to conquer people's soul with the power and the structures of governmental authority. That's what Jesus warned us not to do. And so that's a major stream of theology, really, in the last 60, 70 years that came out in America. It's repugnant to the reader of the New Testament. So what makes America different then? What makes America exceptional and distinct? Well, the tightrope here is that the American system is a system that neither denies God nor enforces God. Did you follow that? This is key. This is crucial. It's a system that neither denies God nor enforces God. Let's look at the two polar opposites that the devil presents. You know how that's how the devil usually works? He doesn't just promote one contrary idea. He promotes several so that you can choose your poison. You know what I mean? And they'll be opposites. So if one is bad, the other is good. No, that one's bad. That makes this one good. We got to have clarity and discernment to think and walk this tightrope. The American system of liberty that our founding fathers gave to us as led by the providence of God doesn't reach into either of these poles. Okay, what are the poles? You know about the Dark Ages, papal Rome. This is where church and state are wedded. It's the grandchild of the Constantinian idea of we will enforce Christianity. When at that point it's not Christianity, because you can't force that. True Christianity can't be coerced, can it? Because it's a free choice to love God, and love cannot be forced. So the papal system, which was adopted in some Protestant settings as well, so-called Protestant settings, as we saw this morning with the Church of England, that's counterfeit number one. Then you get on down in the history, and you come to, let's see, here we're gonna talk about the French Revolution and the Marxist revolutions of the 1800s, okay? Communism, socialism, and the French Revolution. This counterfeit said, well, religion is a persecuting thing. Churches are bad because they acquire political power and rule over others and engage in massacres and destruction and crusades and inquisitions. So we need to cast off all religion. We need to have, religion is the opiate of the masses, said Karl Marx. We want a purely secular society. The French Revolution is the most famous of that, as we're going to look at in just a second. But socialist governments deny God altogether, and that's a religion in and of itself. Karl Marx taught a meta-narrative, if you will. He taught a ideological framework that was looked at through the lenses of class struggle. The proletariat, the good guys, the bourgeoisie, the bad guys. The class struggle to overthrow the owners of capital is redemption. So it's just another religion, really, without a God. It's a godless religion. It's an atheistic ideology that mirrors all the aspects of religion. Same thing today, by the way. We have the descendants of Marxism in our world today. It's usually not referred to as class struggle and Marxism in the traditional sense, but it's cultural Marxism. It's you divide along other lines than class. You divide people along gender, along race, along orientations and such. And that is a way to divide society of the villains versus the virtuous. And then you can achieve the same goals of acquiring power, which is what the communist ideology has always done. So whether it's Marxism, socialism, communism, or cultural Marxism, these secular ideologies are going to lead to the same result. And by the way, they don't always sound secular. The devil's so clever. Did you know that they're so-called Christian, Catholic apologists who dip into this and call it liberation theology? Are you familiar with that term? It has mostly Latin American connotations where the Romanism was very prominent, but it's basically taking Marxism and wearing it as a Christian, putting a Christian cloak over it. So I don't know which side of these you'd put that on, but it's a combination of both to look at the liberation theology. But the bottom line is this is going to be viciously, violently, vociferously opposed to Bible-believing Christianity. It's going to annihilate religious liberty, just like this one did. So we've got to be careful. Some people look at this and they go, oh, enforcement of religion, church and state wedded, we should just get rid of all religion together and that will bring freedom. Not so. How did it work in France? Did it work well in France? This was a revolution that was absolutely destructive to life and liberty in France. It ushered in the reign of terror. It ushered in the guillotine and mass slaughter and executions indiscriminately. It eventually facilitated Napoleonic France in its wake, dictatorship and conquest once again. So it's secular and it's supposedly liberating, but it's military conquest of Europe nonetheless. Death, destruction, and no freedom. Now that's not to say that the powers that be in France that were overthrown by the French Revolution were good. I mean, you had Catholic France, you had monarchy there, and so that's how the devil pits the two against each other. We'll make a really, really, really bad France. You know, John Calvin's there trying to get the Protestant Reformation going. He's kicked out. The Huguenots are persecuted. They flee, and Romanism dominates France. So, well, problem, reaction, solution. Let's overthrow religion altogether, says secular revolution, French Revolution ideology. You could say the Dark Ages was actually the catalyst for the French Revolution and the atheistic ideologies that followed in its wake. Because oppressive religious power, ruling by the sword for centuries, is going to get people pretty upset. And you're going to end up with revolutionary forces that did come to the fore, overthrowing monarchy and etc. But during the time of the Dark Ages, you're aware of the fact that Bible-believing Christianity did exist, right? The earth was in the wilderness, so to speak, for 1,260 years. You had the Waldenses, you had Wycliffe and Huss, and you had the translation of the Bible into the English language. You have these pre-reformatory movements, and then the big one, 1517, we just celebrated the 500th anniversary of that 5 years ago. Martin Luther's Germany, followed by Switzerland, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries, all of them. But France rejected the Reformation. Germany accepted it. Switzerland accepted it. The Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries, all accepted the Reformation, but France dug in their heels and they said, no, not here. And John Calvin had to end up setting up shop in Geneva, in Switzerland. Well, the Protestants who did remain in France, they were called the Huguenots, I mentioned. By the way, this is kind of an interesting fun fact. You know, I told you I had Dutch heritage, so my lineage, my blood is from the Netherlands. But actually, where did the Huguenots flee to when they left France? Was the Netherlands. So actually, some of my lineage is French, even though no French heritage is there at all. It's all Dutch culture, but some of that blood lineage is Huguenots moving to the Netherlands and intermarrying there. But the Protestants who did remain in France, who did not succeed in fleeing, you know what happened to them. It was annihilation time. Events like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where tens of thousands of Bible-believing Christians were slaughtered by the powers that be in papal France, which kind of solidified the reputation of papal Rome and monarchies across Europe as being bloodthirsty and ruthless forces across this continent. Christianity that attempts to rule by the sword and enforces religious dogma is not Christian. It is anti-Christ. So the French Revolution looks at that and says, well, that's terrible. But then they throw the baby out with the bathwater, don't they? They say no religion at all. Religion itself is bad and inherently violent and oppressive. Well, no, it's not. Jesus quoted, and he taught, and we quoted, that we are not to lord it over our fellow man. That is not the gospel. But they couldn't see, or they refused to see, past the particular version or flavor of Christianity that had so persecuted them for so many centuries, a entity that the Bible calls Antichrist, not Christian. So anyway, lesson learned, Satan is a master of having two equal opposites, both of which are equally evil. Pick between papal dominion and atheistic mass murder. I didn't mention the mass murder of the Bastille Day in the French Revolution. This is celebrated as the day that they were liberated from the monarchy and from the priest class of France, but it's a mass uprising where they didn't simply overthrow oppressive religion or oppressive political forces. They sought to de-Christianize the nation of France altogether. Because something is going to be supreme. So what is supreme? Well, what do they elevate as their God, their North Star? They said, well, religion is full of superstitions, and we are in the age of enlightenment. And so we human beings can, through our limited human minds, achieve supremacy of intellectual greatness. So our goddess is reason. Reason, they literally made her their goddess, which you might say, that sounds religious. It's kind of hard to escape all the religious trappings. They made temples of reason. Literally, the Notre Dame Cathedral was seized and converted into a temple of reason, as were other churches. And then you get to the reign of terror. Because when you cast off God, when you cast off moral restraint, when you cast off his law, you get bloodshed. It's just inevitable like night follows day. Robespierre's reign of terror, one of the lowlights in human history, where they had Voltaire, the rights of man. I'm sorry, that was Thomas Paine, but they would talk about libertas, right? And liberty and the rights of man. This was the most neglecting of human rights moment in generations at this time. Anybody who was suspected of potentially harboring any sympathies for the monarchy or for the church was promptly decapitated by the guillotine. And they called it, interestingly, maybe you remember this from your history books of the French Revolution, his reign of terror is what we call it correctly. He called it Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety. Public safety. Now, that's good PR, isn't it? Do we sometimes in our day hear phrases and names given to things where you're like, yeah, I think there's something more going on than that. That's the PR overlay you give to your whatever you might want to call it. This is one of the darkest moments in human history, public safety, but, public health. How about that phrase? Homeland security, or whatever name you might be given to violations of human rights, civil and religious liberties, and death that ensues. So anyway, papal dominion is the opposite of the American Protestant Republic. Socialistic or atheistic, French Revolution style or Marxist secular dominion is also the opposite of the American Republic. Listen to this from The Great Controversy. It says, in that grand old document, which our forefathers set forth as their Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, they declared, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Did you notice? There is a creator. It says they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable, meaning can't be taken away, rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Does that sound like French Revolution? Does that sound like papal Rome? Does that sound like Marxism and communism? Not at all. This is a principle that walked that fine line, that doesn't deny God. The last 6 commandments declaring that stealing and murder is wrong, absolutely, because we are human beings endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights. Then what law It's just a social construct. Whatever the opinion of your society is and whatever our preferences and moral values are, we'll establish those, and there is no foundation anymore. But in the American Republic, there was to be. It doesn't deny God, and it doesn't enforce God. You remember that slide from earlier? That's key. It doesn't deny God, and it doesn't enforce God. This authoritarian secularist state is God in this situation, and over here the Pope is God. And so in both situations you've got a human entity that has taken the place of God, and you don't have liberty. Here you have no church-state enforcement of religion, but you also don't outlaw religion. That's in the First Amendment. Did you know the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. These guys prohibit free exercise also, but it's both. They're both there. We're neither going to enforce religion nor prohibit religion from being exercised. That's a self-evident truth. It is an unalienable right that cannot be taken away. So the American Republic, founded by Protestants, acknowledges the Creator, doesn't enforce religion, doesn't restrict religion, freedom of conscience. So is it any surprise then? This is the earth helped the woman. This is Bible prophecy. It was from America, not France, not Rome, from America, where these principles were laid down, that became the wellspring of 19th century missionary work in Bible societies and the great Second Advent awakening, as we've referenced a number of times, verse 17 of Revelation 12. And here is the remnant of her seed with the truth, with the commandments and the testimony of Jesus. That is beautiful. By the way, that's the only time all day I've got something highlighted in yellow. I know that's obnoxious to look at too frequently, but is that not important? In this case, it gets a yellow highlighting, because this was all God's movement to bring truth to all people of all nations. Now, this toleration of minority religions actually was not invented by America's founding fathers. Well, you may be like, well, of course, we just heard Jesus say to not lord it over people like the Gentiles do. So, but I mean, in the Protestant era, coming out of the Dark Ages, there were groups like the Anabaptists in the 1500s who taught and practiced, we will not take up the sword to enforce religion. We do not want the church and the state to be united. They baptized believers, by the way. That's why they were called Anabaptists or rebaptizers. They called for the complete separation of church and state and for Christians to put their sword back in its place. In the Netherlands, I mentioned, of course, that was a free place that the Pilgrims fled to in 1620. The period of their most tolerant society was called the Dutch Golden Age. They also had the most flourishing of art and prosperity and literature during that time because people were free. It was a free place, and they gave permission for English separatists and any others who, within reason, would come and exercise their religion freely. In America, it was not 1776 that it started that you have religious toleration. In Pennsylvania, from very early on in the 1600s, William Penn, a Quaker, said religious toleration, complete religious freedom in Pennsylvania. You can even be Jewish. You can be whatever you want in Pennsylvania, and we're not going to prohibit the free exercise of religion, nor will we establish a religion. Oh, my favorite of all, Roger Williams of Rhode Island. That was another free society that predated and preceded the American founding. He you might say, was the most enlightened, the most progressive of all of them. He taught that the state has no business regulating the first four commandments of God. That's a true expression of Protestantism, isn't it? Worship is something that is freely offered to God. It cannot be coerced. He said the state has no business on the first four: murder, theft, marriage contracts, lying under oath, and enforcing of business contracts. All of that is part of the state's role. Interestingly, by the way, side note, this is not in my notes, and I didn't plan on this one. I didn't say this one at Amazing Facts. It didn't come to my mind right now. One of the things, when I'm talking about the last 6 commandments here, one of the things I threw in there was marriage contracts. It says in the Great Controversy that one of the things that France got wrong was they diminished marriage to be simply a civil union. So that's some food for thought when you think about the Supreme Court decision from 2015, the LGBTQIA agenda. But this is a true expression of Protestantism. I love it. The first 4 commandments, no business there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor the prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's what the Constitution said. But before the Constitution, you got to look at, I left one off, didn't I? Who did I leave off? The Anabaptists, okay, the Netherlands, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. Who did I leave off? I'll give you a hint. We spent over an hour on them this morning, right? The Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, 1620. And you might say, no, wait a minute, I know about New England. I know that they weren't the most religiously tolerant folks around. You're thinking of Massachusetts Bay. Plymouth Colony, when they established their Mayflower Compact, this was a forerunner to the Declaration of Independence. This was people, a group of people, not by any authority of popes or kings, simply gathering themselves in what they called their own civil body politic. Just a society organized by people, for people, and of the people, as the U.S. Constitution says, we the people, right? These guys blazed the trail for what would later become the Constitution. And in the Mayflower Compact, believers and unbelievers were equal before the law. Do you realize how revolutionary that was? Massachusetts didn't do that. Most of the colonies didn't do that until after the American Revolution. Believers and unbelievers were equal before the law. John Robinson, their pastor back in the Netherlands who sent them off and then they came here, he said, if you encounter people who are of a different faith, different viewpoint, different beliefs, you must exercise tolerance of those whom you disagree with. Now, I mentioned there were some American colonies that were not quite like that, right? They weren't like Plymouth and Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. Virginia, for example, was an Anglican colony. It was Church of England, although when it became an American colony, separated from the British, it wouldn't be Church of England anymore. They became Episcopal, but nonetheless not enforced anymore according to the First Amendment. Maryland was a Catholic colony. And some of the strongest enforcers of their own so-called Protestant religion was actually the Puritans, the cousins of the separatists in Massachusetts Bay. And you read about this in the Great Controversy. They sought freedom from persecution in Europe and ended up coming here and persecuting people who did not agree with their doctrines. And that's why I draw this very strong distinction here between Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritans, versus, Plymouth Colony, the separatists. The separatists were the ones we studied this morning, the Pilgrims. They didn't do what these guys did when Roger Williams, interestingly, Roger Williams founded Rhode Island because he was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony. A lady was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony named Anne Hutchinson. So for all their virtues, and I know I haven't mentioned any of their virtues, so I haven't been very fair to the Puritans this afternoon or this morning. So they had many virtues. You read about them in the Great Controversy. And so for all their virtues, though, they had an established church state with citizenship tied to church membership. You weren't a member of the church, you're not a citizen. They later on established the halfway covenant and did some maneuvering with that, but they banished these people. These were the ones where the Salem witch trials were held. So some of the darker periods that we use proverbially in our day, it's a checkered past, at least, for the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, where the persecuted became, to a certain extent, the persecutors. And that's not all they were, but that's a big black mark on Massachusetts Bay. But the Founding Fathers, who wrote our Constitution, did not take their cues from Massachusetts Bay. They did not take their cues from the Puritans. Where did they take it from? Roger Williams, from Pennsylvania, from those old Pilgrims. So the Constitution in 1787 was written to walk that line that we've been talking about for some time. Now I want to share a couple more miracles with you. Have you ever heard of the book, The Miracle at Philadelphia? The idea that the Constitution was actually ratified and came into being and we formed a country is a miraculous thing in and of itself. Listen to George Washington's statement about it. He said, "It appears to me then, little short of a miracle, that the delegates from so many different states, which states you know are also different from each other in their manners, circumstances, and prejudices, would unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections." He says it's nothing short of a miracle. It's little short of a miracle that these states actually agreed and formed a more perfect union. Here's James Madison's statement. He's called the father of the Constitution because he took extensive notes there at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention of 1787. He says, "The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with unanimity, almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of the almighty hand, which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the Revolution. They all understood Providence had been involved in the Revolutionary War, but James Madison is saying, you guys realize that the same hand of Providence that gave us that victory, those miracles against the British, that same hand was involved with making this actually happen. I mean, they had to have a bunch of compromises. You remember learning that in middle school and civics class or whatever? The Great Compromise and all these different compromises about a bicameral legislature and how to count population when you got slave states who are a part of the Union and they want their slave population to count. And you're like, wait, they're not citizens. They don't have freedom. How does their slave population count? Well, they just wanted more representation in the House of Representatives. So it was kind of a fraudulent claim to begin with. But then the North, who's like, well, those are people. They're like, well, we don't want your slave population to count because we want you to have less representation in the House of Representatives. So they came up with a 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of the slave population will count for your population for representation in the House of Representatives. Abominable. By the way, some people have said erroneously that at the time of the founding generation, they counted a black person as 3/5 of a person. That's not correct. It's worse. The southern states counted them not as a person at all. And so they had no rights whatsoever. So 3/5 of the person actually exaggerates the issue. Up north, in the free states, they had citizenship and freedom, but in those southern states, not so. Now, that's my last slide on that, but I thought I had something on the Civil War. I do. Last thing, you guys thinking of your questions? Because we can chat, we can talk as soon as we're done here, if you'd like to. I just had these slides hidden because I had to abbreviate this for the amazing facts because they got me on the clock. Oh, yes, thank you for doing that. Okay, I'll do the Civil War thing in a second, because right while I'm thinking about it, 1617, this is so fun. Okay, so I'm studying, I'm going to pull up the morning's presentation and pull up that slide that I skipped. I'm studying through the Pilgrims. They're in the Netherlands in 1617, right? And then they make a decision. So they were there from like 1608 to 1620. In 1617, they made the decision to prepare for departing from the Netherlands to come to America. Do you remember that? I'm Control F, 1617. That's how I'll find this. There it is. Okay. Here, I'm going to put that up so you can get the visual image again. Start from the beginning is F5. Is it just shift F5 now? Yes. All right. Praise God. With my new keyboard shortcuts, I don't have them figured out yet because my keyboard decided to change its methods on me. So here we are in the Netherlands again in 1617. The Pilgrims have fled England. They're worshiping there freely. They're trying to do mission work. It's not really getting along. Their printing press is getting seized, and William Brewster is back in England laying plans, and then he brings it back, and the people make the decision. And they say, when God's providential finger is pointing them across the Atlantic, they say, we will go. That was from the Great Controversy, right? Now, 1617 was an interesting year that they felt led to make that decision. Because remember I mentioned that at one point there were arrows coming in from the woods and hostile Indian tribes that were not pleased about any people around, and they were going to kill them. They're invaders. They're bad. The Wampanoags, they were able to forge that friendship and have a positive relationship, but not all the tribes in the area felt that way. Not all of them were that objective toward these Pilgrims. They said these are conquerors. These are bad people. Warlike tribes that are more into kind of the violent dominion you sometimes hear about the European colonists versus Indian wars and the horrible, horrific things that you don't want to mention. My brain is going to places of things you don't want to say out loud. You know what I mean? Just the gruesome nature of human conquest and violence. So there was a warlike tribe there in New England. And tragically, they experienced a plague that wiped out the entire tribe. These were the ones on the very land that the Pilgrims would come and visit, and God would place them right there in Provincetown Harbor. They would come, they would find the springs, they would find the corn, and they found cleared lands ready for planting. I mean, it takes something to clear land and prepare it for planting, right? The tribe that had been decimated had been right there, and all the area tribes wanted hands off of that because of superstitions about that's where the plague was. So the warlike tribe is gone. The area is cleared and ready for possession where the earth helps out the woman. And that very same year is when they feel impressed by God. Now is the time to go. What if they would have gone 2 years earlier? They would have been annihilated by that warlike tribe. By the way, Squanto was a member of that warlike tribe. So you don't do stereotyping of everybody in that tribe was all evil, because he was the one that was converted to Christianity and became the best friend of the Pilgrims. Okay, so we're not trying to be hard on that tribe, like they needed to be annihilated and God got them. That's not the idea. It's that happened to be the year that plague happened, and then the Pilgrims were impressed. Now's the time. So I found that to be absolutely fascinating, that was when they felt led by God. It was when the earth became the earth. I mean, it wasn't sparsely populated in 1616. There was a warlike tribe there who would have, Okay, so next thing on the Civil War, and then we're done. Are you guys thinking of your questions? Because we could talk about anything religious liberty related. It's Religious Liberty Weekend, so any of this history or anything you want to talk about. All right, last fun thing about Providence in history is in the Civil War. This is from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 264. And the reason I share this with you is not only because it's another awesome example, but because it's from inspired source here. Because some would object to the way that we've done history today in identifying Providence. I remember in my academic training, they would scoff at that. They'd be like, providential history, oh, you Christians, and you're jumping to conclusions about things. We only go on evidence. And, well, wait a minute, isn't there plenty of evidence for all these crazy coincidences, not just being coincidences, because there's so many of them, and they're so improbable? So you look at it objectively, and you draw conclusions about Providence, like the Founding Fathers did, who, again, were not like, second grade awakening Baptists, Methodists, religious revivalists. They were largely secular people with a belief in God, but they weren't out there necessarily trying to proclaim an everlasting gospel and using this as an opportunity to give providence and glory to God. They were just being objective. This is God's providence, because they couldn't deny it. But nonetheless, you're not supposed to do that. If any of you ever have studied in history in academia, this is like sin number one, is don't try to do providential history. And I learned that from Christian historians, interestingly. That's shameful, but I've since gone back and revised how we do history, because when you study the Bible and you study Spirit of Prophecy, you go, oh, yeah, it is his story. It's all providence. Why would a Christian not want to see the hand of the providential God involved in history? It's strange to me. I think it's to seek acceptance from the secular, historians of the same profession, so we can get published and we can be recognized and respected by them. But I don't care at all about that. I want to witness. I don't want to try to fit in to their ideology. So you want to win them to the truth. Anyway, that's the main reason I wanted to show you this is how you do history too. It's providential history from an inspired source. But here is the cool example. So it says, God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. This is when the Civil War had started. He has, this is where I got that quote from, he has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. So then you're going to see in vision what Sister White was shown, Ellen G. White was shown about this battle that took place at the beginning of the Civil War. At the conference at Roosevelt, New York, August 3, 1861, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery, which has so long been a curse to this nation. The North and the South were presented before me. The North has been deceived in regard to the South. They are better prepared for war than has been represented. The South is. Most of their men are well skilled in the use of arms, some of them from experience in battle, others from habitual sporting. They have the advantage of the North in this respect, but have not, as a general thing, the valor and the power of endurance that Northern men have. I had a view of the disastrous battle at Manassas, Virginia. Now, you'll read the historical accounts of the battle at Manassas, Virginia, and it's a mystery. Like, whoa, what happened there? We're going to get the answer to what happened. It was a most exciting, distressing scene. The Southern army had everything in their favor and were prepared for a dreadful contest. The Northern army was moving on with triumph, not doubting but that they would be victorious. Many were reckless and marched forward boastingly as though victory were already theirs. As they neared the battlefield, many were almost fainting through weariness and want of refreshment. They did not expect so fierce an encounter. They rushed into battle and fought bravely, desperately. The dead and dying were on every side. Both the North and the South suffered severely. The Southern men felt the battle, and in a little while would have been driven back still further. Excuse me. The Northern men were rushing on, although their destruction was very great. Just then, an angel descended and waved his hand backward. Did you hear that? An actual angel appeared on the battlefield and moved events. Instantly, there was confusion in the ranks. It appeared to the Northern men that their troops were retreating when it was not so in reality, and a precipitate retreat commenced. This seemed wonderful to me. Then it was explained that God has this nation in his own hand and would not suffer victories to be gained faster than he ordained, and would permit no more losses to the Northern men than in his wisdom he saw it fit to punish them for their sins. And had the Northern army at this time pushed the battle still further in their fainting, exhausted condition, the far greater struggle and destruction which awaited them would have caused great triumph in the South. So God allowed the North to suffer a lot in that battle, but not as much as they could have. God would not permit this and sent an angel to interfere. God would not permit the great triumph in the South and the victory for the South. The sudden falling back of the Northern troops is a mystery to all. They know not that God's hand was in the matter. Hey, that's a phrase we could apply to everything we've studied in this historical lesson this afternoon and this morning. God's hand was in the matter. And we have nothing to fear, lest we forget how he has led us, and his hand has been in the matter all along. So the future that is ahead of us sometimes is dark and foreboding and ominous and mysterious, but prophecy shines a light on that. And we know that God's providence in the past and his prophecy yet to come is as sure as anything that you could, as sure as night follows day. So studying this history only gives me greater faith and trust in the God of heaven as providentially leading all of us, of all nations and all people. So that's it for that session. I hope you enjoyed that Civil War one. I almost forgot the Civil War part. That was like the capstone of it all, straight from Spirit of Prophecy. It's fun to hear it from George Washington and others where they say what happened and say they believed it was providence, but then you hear it from the pen of inspiration.